Cowabunga dudes, hi year 10. It's Mr. Azapadi with a new video lesson about Christian views on reconciliation. This lesson goes hand in hand with a lesson on forgiveness because forgiveness and reconciliation are kind of two sides of the same coin. We'll talk about the definition of reconciliation in a minute. If I was going to do this lesson in the classroom, I would have done this as a starter, just to feedback on forgiveness. We should forgive people who do something bad to us. So that could be a 15-mark question. So we'd just discuss some of the reasons for and against. We would look at the Christian reasons. If you remember back to your last video lesson, you could look at Jesus forgiving his killers on the cross, saying, "Father, forgive them; they don't know what they're doing." We need to be forgiven by God to get to heaven, so we need to forgive other people. Jesus said, "Forgive 70 times 7 times." And what was the last one? Oh yeah, if your brother sins, rebuke him. If he repents, forgive him. So that one was on the one that seemed to be saying, forgive people, but only if they admit they've done wrong and they ask for forgiveness. So those are all reasons to forgive. You could also have, not such directly religious reasons. For example, in the case of G. Walker that we looked at last time, she forgave her son's killers, and she gave some religious reasons, but another reason she gave was the idea that, well, carrying around hatred and resentment is a heavy load to burden yourself with, so it's better to just forgive people for your own benefit. But then you could have, we looked also at some reasons against forgiveness, like we looked at the words of Sally Dowler. We looked at just the general idea that maybe forgiving people all the time makes you a walkover and makes it so people don't learn to do what they've done is wrong. We looked at the idea that maybe people could see it as a betrayal of a loved one if you forgive someone who harmed a loved one, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so that was forgiveness. This is reconciliation. Reconciliation means, here's a definition, and you need to have this definition in your notes. The restoring of relationships between former enemies. This can be between individuals or groups of people. So if you can write that definition down, I should say that this lesson it's a lot of note taking and a lot of answering questions based on reading. So there's going to be a reading in the Microsoft Teams post when I put this up. There should be a reading on there too, and most of this lesson will be based on those readings. So just to let you know that. So yeah, the restoring of relationships between former enemies. This can be between groups, between individuals or groups of people. So the idea in Christianity is that, as well as forgiving people, a process of restoration or reconciliation should take place. That means that you should build bridges with those people and try to re-establish friendly relations with those people. So in a way, Christianity takes forgiveness further than just saying that you forgive someone. It should be taking active steps to kind of bring yourself back together with that person in a good relationship with that person. Now, why is reconciliation important? Well, there's no separate quotes for reconciliation. So if you're explaining the importance of reconciliation, you would just use the quotes about forgiveness. And you just have to explain that Christians believe that when you forgive, you also should reconcile with people. So for Christians, those two go hand in hand. Jesus doesn't say forgiveness in one place and then reconciliation somewhere else. Christians just believe that forgiveness and reconciliation are two sides of the same coin. You should not only forgive people, but you should try to rebuild your relationship with that person too. Okay. So here's a little bit more on reconciliation. I want you to copy out the stuff that's in bold here. Christians believe that we should forgive and look for reconciliation with people who have done something wrong against us. This does not mean that we ignore what has been done. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not easy, and the person who has sinned must repent. That means admit they've done something wrong. But it does mean that we must always seek reconciliation instead of harsh retribution. Retribution means like revenge. So Christianity is against harsh retribution, and it's in favour of, when we can, looking for reconciliation, rebuilding relationships between people. So if you can copy out that stuff in bold. Now we're going to look at 3 examples of Christian reconciliation. The first one is about from South Africa. We looked at apartheid in South Africa, in our lessons on relationships and family, when we did a lesson on racism and Christianity. So you could have notes already on apartheid. So until the early 1990s, South Africa had this racist system of apartheid in their government, which meant that black and white people were treated differently, unequally, and kind of separated, kept separate from each other. And yeah, separate, but also unequal. The white people had all the power, and black people had very few rights. When it ended, when apartheid came to an end, Nelson Mandela, who had been imprisoned by the white government, actually was elected the president of South Africa. He became the president. Now, in that situation, the majority of people in South Africa are black, and the minority are white. And so in that situation, you could have had a situation where, a black president takes power, suddenly there's equal rights for black people. You could have seen a situation where there could have been large-scale trials for the people who'd violated the rights of black people. They could have put people who were guilty of treating people unequally under apartheid, who were guilty of keeping those laws going. They could have put them on trial and put them to prison. However, instead of doing that, they set up in South Africa something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who is a black priest in the church in South Africa. Now, and he'd also been someone who'd actively campaigned for the rights of black people during apartheid. There's a video there. I'll put the video link in the description of this video so you can watch it if you want. But what the truth, there's going to be a reading as well, so this is all on your reading, but I'll just give you some details. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the whole point was that what they wanted to do in South Africa is they felt if apartheid ended and black people, because most people in the country were black, that means suddenly black people came to power, but most people in the government were black rather than white. The worry they had was if they put the white people who had been guilty of crimes under apartheid, if they put them on trial, sent lots of people to prison, it would just cause further conflict between the two communities. These two communities have had massive conflict in the past. Obviously, the white people have treated black people very poorly, but the feeling was amongst the people who took power, Nelson Mandela and people like that if they had these massive trials and sent loads of people to prison, then it would just end up in more bitterness and more hatred between the two communities. Instead, they did this thing called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what they did in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was basically to hold these, they were like court cases, but they weren't trials. All they were chances for people to speak up about what had happened during apartheid. So black people who'd been the victims under apartheid, who'd been particularly, the worst victims of the abuse, would come to the court and tell their story. And then white people could come to the court, people who'd been accused of crimes, and talk about what they'd done, admit what they'd done was wrong. The idea was that instead of it being a process that aimed to punish people, it's just a process that aimed to get out into the open the things that had happened, to kind of tell everybody about what had happened and kind of make a fresh start between the two communities afterwards. So that was Desmond Tutu, the guy that organised it. That was his whole idea. He was a Christian, so it had Christian, it was a Christian solution to this problem. The idea was we need to say what's happened under apartheid, but instead of taking retribution, we should try to build reconciliation between black and white people. With that in mind, is what I want you to do. Use the reading. I've described it briefly. Use the reading. So I want you to use the reading that's there. Firstly, describe the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I want you to do these 3 tasks. Why was it set up? What did it do? And what were its aims? Why might this kind of response to apartheid be better than having mass trials of those who abused human rights in the past? So the idea here is that if you put lots of people on trial, you just result in more anger and bitterness between the two communities, black and white communities in South Africa. They wanted to bring reconciliation and peace instead. And then I want you to copy the quote from Desmond Tutu. What does it mean? And can you link to the quote to any Christian teachings? That's a bit of an extension one, that last one. So what is he saying in the quote? And can you link it to the Christian teachings? The teaching I'm really thinking of is the idea that all human beings are created in the image of God. See if you can link it to that teaching. Okay, so that's the first task I want you to do, the first example of reconciliation. Let's move on to the next one. Remember, sorry, I should say, pause this. If the best thing to do would be to pause this, do this task, and then move on. Okay, if I was going to do this in a lesson, I would put this slide up now and ask you if anyone knows which country this is about. So see if you can guess by looking at the pictures which country we're talking about here. Okay, so hopefully you guessed, or you might not have, I don't know. But this is about Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. If you look at the top picture there in the middle, the part that's blue, is it dark blue? While the rest is orange, that is Northern Ireland. So you might know a lot about Northern Ireland, you might know very little. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of Northern Ireland, and we'll see why reconciliation has become a big deal there. So Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, along with England, Scotland and Wales. But it's unusual in the fact that it's actually physically it's part of a different country, which is the Republic of Ireland. It's the north part of the island of Ireland. So why is that? Why is the rest of Ireland an independent country and Northern Ireland is still part of Britain? So in the past, Ireland was a colony of Britain. So the British ruled over Ireland for quite some time. When Ireland gained its independence from Britain, the decision was taken. The northern part of Ireland stayed part of Britain. So the rest of Ireland became an independent country, and the northern part stayed part of Britain. Now, the reason for that pretty much was this: that Irish people are generally Roman Catholic. So most people who are from Ireland have traditionally been. It's changing a bit now. Like Britain, it's becoming a less religious country, but traditionally, most people in Ireland were Roman Catholic, and England was a Protestant country because of Henry VIII making the Church of England a Protestant church all that time ago. So there's always been that difference between Northern Ireland and Britain. Republic of Ireland and Britain. When when the British ruled over Ireland, they moved quite a lot of people, Protestant people, into Northern Ireland. So the people were given land and things like that. So lots of people from Northern Ireland who were in Northern Ireland don't trace their roots back to Ireland. Then they see themselves as British rather than Irish, and and they're Protestant rather than Catholic. So you had this situation where in the rest of Ireland, most people see themselves as Irish and are Catholics, whereas in the north of Ireland, in Northern Ireland, you have two communities. Some people, one community which is Catholic and see themselves as Irish, and one community which is Protestant and see themselves as British. So that is why when independence ended, there was a bit of a dilemma for what to do in Northern Ireland. Do you do what the Catholic people in Northern Ireland would have wanted, which is make Northern Ireland part of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, or do you do what the Protestant people would have wanted on the whole and keep it as part of Britain? Eventually, so in the end, it stayed part of Britain, but there were a lot of problems that brought. So that's why Northern Ireland for a long time was famous in a not very nice way for issues of violence and terrorism. So what happened was the Protestants in Northern Ireland had always been a majority, and they'd always been the more wealthy community and more powerful community. Catholics in Northern Ireland were a minority and were less wealthy, and over time it was felt that by many Catholics that they had been discriminated against in Northern Ireland, that they weren't being treated fairly, that the Protestants had much better opportunities in terms of education, jobs, housing, and all these kind of issues that are important to people. There were protests against this, and there was Catholic people protested against what they thought was unfair, and eventually this led to the emergence of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Now, the IRA were a group who decided that they believed the only way for the Catholic people really needed for Northern Ireland to become part of Ireland. So their idea was they need to fight for Northern Ireland to be part of the Republic of Ireland, and to that end they used violence as their means. So that developed in the second half of the 20th century. That developed, And so when I was growing up in the 1980s, the IRA were a very famous organisation because they had planned they did terrorist attacks not only in Northern Ireland but also in England because they saw themselves enemies of the British government. So this is the kind of the conflict that has happened in Northern Ireland between two groups of Christians. There are Protestants on one hand and Catholics on the other. Protestants identify with Britain and want to stay part of Britain. Catholics identify with Ireland and want Northern Ireland to be part of the Republic of Ireland. Now, like I say, it's not just the issue of who runs the island, Northern Ireland, that they care about. That's one of the issues, but there's also this issue of Catholics feeling that they've been discriminated against in Northern Ireland, and that their rights weren't being listened to, and that might have led to people supporting the IRA and the idea that they wanted to get away from Britain and be part of Ireland. So that's a kind of bit of the history of Northern Ireland, and it means that the two communities in Northern Ireland have in the past been very, very divided, and still probably are. We can still probably say that they're quite divided now. In the 90s, there was a peace agreement, and the violence stopped. So there was in the 70s and 80s and some of the 90s there was violence on both sides. The IRA were most famous, but there were also violent groups on the Protestant side. So the IRA would attack, and then the Protestant side would attack back, and so there was a lot of violence in Northern Ireland. In the 90s, there was a peace agreement, and a lot of the violence stopped. However, the tension between the two communities is still there. What they have in Ireland is that they have a local parliament, and they have like a power sharing thing where both Protestant and Catholic political groups sit in the the parliament they have there, and they share power. But there's still a kind of tension between the two groups. There's still some hostility between the two groups, and there has been in recent months some return to violence amongst some groups. Now, what's this got to do with firstly, you might think, why have I got Celtic and Rangers in the middle there if you're a football fan? Because they're not from Northern Ireland. They're not from Ireland at all. They're from Glasgow in Scotland. But the origins of many of the people in Glasgow, many people in Glasgow trace their origins back to Ireland. And that divide between the two communities in Northern Ireland is also reflected in the divide between the two communities you find in Glasgow and Scotland. So you have Celtic, who are traditionally represent the Catholic community, and Rangers, who traditionally represent the Protestant community. So if you go to Northern Ireland, you quite often see people wearing the football shirts of those two teams, Rangers and Celtic, even though the team play in another city, because they're very much linked to the identity of the communities in Northern Ireland. Okay, what's it got to do with reconciliation? Well, we're talking. The reason we're talking about Northern Ireland is because Corrymeela, which is the sign, if you see at the bottom of the screen, there's a sign that says Corrymeela. Corrymeela is an organisation in Northern Ireland which tries to bring peace and reconciliation between Protestants and Catholics. The amount of violence between Protestant and Catholics, the different ideas about who should run their country, and also just the kind of everyday life where the two communities are very divided. They tend to live in different parts of Northern Ireland. Like in the capital Belfast, there'll be areas that are very Protestant, areas that are very Catholic, and that means that as well as these kind of political difficulties, people just often grow up not knowing people from other communities. They'll either know Catholics or Protestants. So all of that means that there's a big divide between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, and Corrymeela is a place which tries to bring reconciliation between these two groups of Christians, tries to bring Catholics and Protestants together. So look, I've talked a lot there. I would go to your reading for the next bit. So I've tried to give you a bit of background on it. It's quite a complex situation, but the reading should be pretty clear. I want you to answer these questions about Corrymeela. Which two groups is the conflict between? It's between Protestants and Catholics. I've already said that. Explain two reasons for the conflict. They're on your sheet, but I've also talked a bit about them. What does Corrymeela mean? What does that word mean? It's a Gaelic word, which is the Irish language. And explain two things that it does to bring peace. What does it actually do to try and bring reconciliation? So there's another example of reconciliation. We've got one in South Africa, one in Northern Ireland. Let's have a look at the third. Okay, this is a the two so far that I've given have been more examples of two communities. You've got the black and white communities in apartheid, South Africa. You've got the Catholic and Protestant communities in Northern Ireland. Here it's much more an example of two people. So this case is similar to the G. Walker case. It's an American case. Again, it's about a mother whose son was killed and who forgave the killer. What's remarkable about this case, though, is that in this case she not only forgave the killer, but reconciliation came between them as well. So they reconciled them and in fact, she became friends with her son's killer and helped him in his life. She helped him in various ways to get jobs and find a place to live. I don't know if she helped him get a job. You have to have a look at the reading to do that. But she helped him in various ways when he got out of prison. There's a video there. I'll put the video in the description if you want to watch it. That would be great. But here are the questions I want you to answer. So the woman's name is Mary Johnson, and the person who the killer was called O'Shea Israel. So I want you to answer these three questions. What was O'Shea Israel's crime and how was he punished? What punishment did he get? What did Mary Johnson do to reconcile with Israel? Copy the quote from Mary Johnson in the final paragraph. So in the final paragraph of your reading, there's a quote there. According to this quote, why is forgiveness and reconciliation important? So those are the three things I want you to do. So again, just another example of reconciliation when Christians have forgiven, but not just forgiven, but reconciled, being brought together with the person who did harm to them. Okay, not going to ask you to write a 6 marker, but I'm just going to talk you through it. It might be good if you could put this title down, just make some notes on it, explaining why and how Christians practice reconciliation. These why and how questions for some topics are quite likely to come up, and it's very important that you are answering both parts of the question, why and how. So if you're going to talk about why Christians practice reconciliation, you need basically the same kind of evidence as you would for a question on forgiveness. So you'd say, well, for example, Christians practice reconciliation because they believe that if you, because Jesus told people to forgive and be reconciled to people who caused them harm. Then you could put the quote, when he was asked how many times should you forgive, he said not 7, but 70 times 7 times you should forgive. This shows that no matter how many times someone does harm to you, you should still forgive them and look for reconciliation with them. So all you need to do really for the why bit is use your quotes for forgiveness, but just make sure that you build into your explanation the idea that, well, this is about the idea that you should forgive and seek reconciliation with that person. That's what you need to do there. And so for a 6-mark question, you could have either 1 or 2 SEEs about why you would forgive, the why things. So you'd have 1 or 2 about why forgiveness and reconciliation are important. Hope that makes sense. So you're just using the same evidence as forgiveness, but just kind of extending the explanations to talk about reconciliation, because they are kind of two sides of the same coin. The key thing here, though, is that you need it says why and how Christians practice reconciliation. When it says how, you need to give an example. So at least one of your SEEs, or maybe 2 of them, would have to be about an example of reconciliation, and that's what we've looked at today. So you could use Desmond Tutu and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You could use Corrie Miller in Northern Ireland, or you could use Mary Johnson forgiving her son's killer. Now, the thing about how paragraphs is sometimes it's not really easy to do an SEE in the sense of statement, evidence, explanation. And I would definitely make some notes on what I'm saying here, because this is something that's going to come up again late in other parts of the course. Because if you think about something like describing what happened, say in Corrie Miller that we've talked about in Northern Ireland. Now, it's very difficult to think of a statement, evidence, explanation in terms of writing about Corrie Miller, because really, when you're talking about Corrie Miller, you're just really describing what they do in Corrie Miller. So in this situation, I think you would need to think not in terms of statement, evidence, explanation, but of statement, explanation, expand your explanation. So it's kind of statement, explanation, expand. And this is, and I would admit that this is much more of it's much vaguer and more difficult to say exactly what you need to do here. But I'll give you an example. So, say I wanted to write about Corey Miller, I would write something like this. I'd say one way in which Christians practice reconciliation is one example of how Christians practice reconciliation is Corey Miller in Northern Ireland. So that's my statement. Then I would explain. I'd explain a little bit. I would say. Um, uh, Corey Miller uh, attempts to create reconciliation between the Protestant and Catholic communities in Northern Ireland, who have historically been divided over the question of who should, how the country should be run, and who Northern Ireland should belong to, whether they should belong to Ireland, Republic of Ireland, or to Britain. And then I add something in my explanation there. I'd say this in the past, this conflict has led to deep divisions between the communities and also to violence. And then I'd expand a little bit. So I've said, here's Corey Miller, here's what it does, and then expand it by saying, well, what kind of things do they do when they try and bring reconciliation? So I'd say something like, well, Corey Miller brings reconciliation by bringing victims of violence face to face with people who have committed acts of violence in order to, build bridges between them. It also brings children from Protestant and Catholic families together who may have never met each other before in order to build closer links between the two communities, something like that. Now, I haven't been very articulate there because I haven't got the reading in front of me, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is that when you do why, it's nice and easy because you give a reason why, you give a quote, then you explain the quote usually. When it's how, it's not such a kind of statement evident explanation. It's more a statement, here's a way that they practice reconciliation, you describe it, and then you expand on it to give a deeper explanation. I hope that makes sense. If there's anything that's really confusing about what I've said today, do get in touch with me. Okay, the next week there'll be 2 lessons because I think this is the week of 3 and next is the week of 2. But yeah, next week there'll be 2 lessons. Okay, thanks. Bye.